Yes, we can start now. I think we have enough participants.
Shall we begin? Okay.
Okay, yeah, seems like it. Um, so,
Okay. I would like to say something. Okay, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to day 4 of the GIAN course on unraveling the problem of history, exploring African and Indian writing. It is a pleasure to have you all with us today. Today's session will be led by Professor Stefan Helgeson, and we all are familiar with him now, I guess so. In today's session, Professor Helgeson will be delivering two lectures on interconnected themes, followed by a tutorial session where participants can ask questions and engage in discussions. Before we begin, here are some important points to keep in mind. Please post your questions in the chat box and they will be addressed during the tutorial session. And your attendance is being recorded and the session is also being recorded for reference, and the session will be in two parts. The first will commence from 12:30 to 2:30 p.m. IST, and the second will be from 8:30 to 10 p.m. And there will be no break during the session, but if professor prefers a short pause, we will accommodate it. And the tutorial session will take place soon after the lecture, where we will engage in further discussions based on the lecture. Okay, now let us begin. I invite Professor Stefan Helgeson to deliver the first lecture on Gandhi's printing press in Durban and other oceanic approaches to African history. Please, sir.
thank you so much for that introduction. Could I just double check the times you mentioned? Because in the latest version of the schedule I have, it says that let's see, my lecture. Aha, yes, okay, sorry. No, you're absolutely right. It says 8:30. I thought it was 7:30. Never mind. That's
Stefan,
perfectly.
can you see this mask?
Sorry. Yes, I can.
Uh, these are African masks.
Ah,
Sorry.
in your
Carry
in
on.
your home.
Carry on. Yeah, no, this
Yes.
is office. This is Rizwan
Office.
sir's office.
Okay. Marvelous.
Yeah.
Okay. Sorry. I double checked. Yes, the times were entirely correct. And just to clarify, I will. I mean, my two lectures today will be somewhat shorter than the ones I've delivered so far, and now it'll be on the oceanic approaches to history, and then in the evening, your time, I'll be talking about post-apartheid writing. Now, just before we begin, um, I just want to acknowledge that very interesting question that was posted on WhatsApp after um, yesterday's session, and I can. Yeah, so this is Chitra writing. As I understand it, the Rise of Expectation works with the hermeneutic of remembrance as Paul Ricoeur used it to conceptualize narrative as an inherently human ability to harmonize parts into an intelligible whole. How would this change for narratives which are discordant, as Gona's novels read as trauma narratives dealing with the problem of unrecoverability of past and the termination of the present in repetition? What will be the horizons of expectations then? That's a very perceptive and profound question. I haven't mentioned Ricoeur so far, but he lurks there in the background of my own thinking, and I think that question identifies precisely um, one of the key challenges that a writer like Abdulrazak Gurna is dealing with, the difficulty to make the past cohere, and so to speak, narrativize it in such a way. Instead, it is shaped by fragmentation and disconnection, which I suppose makes the achievement of many migrant writers all the greater in a way. I'm thinking here of the Caribbean poet Derek Walcott, who said that the love that is required to put together a broken vase is much greater than the love that went into making it in the first place. Okay, so with that, perhaps we can project my slides for today.
Alina, please present the slides.
So, I when preparing this course, it just struck me that this should be of particular interest to you, and the ways in which the Indian Ocean and specifically Gandhi also then figures in African contexts, in South African contexts. Next slide, please. So, as mentioned, I have a much shorter talk today, but we will also be viewing part of a lecture by Isabel Hofmeyr as part of the sort of the tutorial session. But I want to begin by looking at what I call two oceanic paradigms of study, as this has become very influential in literary and cultural studies. And I'll then just mention a few literary examples of relevance, and end by a reflection on how this lecture, which really engages space, the oceans understood as space, how that sort of ties in with the more sort of temporal approach that I've been adopting in these lectures thus far. So, next slide, please. I assigned this this essay by Isabel Hofmeyr as part of the reading, the Black Atlantic Meets the Indian Ocean, which he published in 2007. And I should perhaps begin by saying something about Isabel Hofmeyr. She is a South African academic. She was a professor for many years at the Department of African Literature at Witwatersrand University in South Africa. She recently retired, but is still very active, and has over the years been extremely important in sort of reshaping the terrain of literary and cultural studies in South Africa, and has an international standing. So she's an important figure, and one of her most famous books is called The Portable Bunyan, A Transnational History of the Pilgrim's Progress, which was published in 2004, and is really a study. I mentioned the Pilgrim's Progress in a previous lecture. Is a study of the African translations and the African distribution of the Pilgrim's Progress, which really was a big cultural phenomenon in the 19th and early 20th centuries, that occurred very much on the back of the whole sort of Protestant mission endeavor. And what one could see there in that book was how Hofmeyr cultivated a form of a book historical approach to literary studies. She focused very much on the actual books, their covers, the print, how these objects had been circulating and so on in that study on the Pilgrim's Progress, and that sort of that method of following the object is one that she then has continued to develop. And when she wrote this article in 2007, she was just sort of embarking on sort of the Indian Ocean leg of her academic journey. Okay, so here is a short quotation from that article. The Black Atlantic, Hofmeyr writes, has become a shorthand term for understanding the Atlantic seaboard as the site for the emergence of capitalist modernity as a transnational system. So the whole this article hinges precisely around the comparison between the Black Atlantic and the Indian Ocean. So we need to understand what is meant here by the Black Atlantic to begin with. Next slide. So I assume that you are familiar with this work. It's a book by Paul Gilroy, a big name in cultural studies in Britain. And the Black Atlantic was really his coinage, and he uses the term to name the transnational cultural formation shaped by the slave trade and its aftermath, the transatlantic slave trade. And it calls the Black Atlantic a counterculture of modernity. Okay, so what he's doing here is really two things at the same time. He's making the Black history of modernity visible. We need to recall that the transatlantic slave trade completely transformed the Western Hemisphere. Half the population of Brazil, for instance, with its I don't know how many million, 250 million or so inhabitants, half of that population has slave ancestry. The Black minority in the United States, as we know, is hugely significant, both culturally and politically. But this brings us to the second point that Gilroy is making. That was for a long time simply understood in national terms. It was a United States phenomenon, or it was a Brazilian phenomenon, or it was a Jamaican phenomenon with this sort of slave heritage. Gilroy's point is that the different Afro-diasporic cultures of the Atlantic, they were sort of in touch with each other, and they were not confined really by national borders. Instead, Gilroy sees sort of the ship as the true site of Black Atlantic culture. First in the tragic mode. I mean, the slave ships bringing Africans to the Western Hemisphere, but later also, I mean, these slaves and then descendants of slaves were, among other things, seafarers. They worked on board ship, and in that way there was this constant communication between these groups. Next slide, please. So this is Gilroy then. The contemporary Black English, like the Anglo-Africans of earlier generations, and perhaps like all Blacks in the West, stand between at least two great cultural assemblages, both of which have mutated through the course of the modern world, that formed and assumed new configurations. So the two cultural assemblages are essentially Africa and the West, by Gilroy's account. And sort of standing between those two requires, and this is a key term in Gilroy's work, requires the cultivation of a double consciousness. And this is a term that Gilroy borrows from the great pioneering American sociologist W.E.B. Du Bois, who in his very fine and important book, The Souls of Black Folk, from 1903, I think, articulated this notion of double consciousness. That for him it was a United States phenomenon at the time, but his point was that a Black American is forced to think of him or herself from two perspectives at the same time, both from sort of the subjective perspective of the self, but also has to understand that there's a white gaze that sort of defines who that self is. So double consciousness means having to sort of regard oneself both from the inside and the outside at the same time. And it's this double consciousness that then generates the critical potential, the critical impetus of this counterculture of modernity, and it's in that way Gilroy sort of provides an explanatory framework for the vitality and significance of Black expressive cultures, not least through music, which has become so globally influential. Jazz music, hip hop, rock music. It's impossible to think of contemporary music without taking the history of the sort of the Black Atlantic culture into account. Next slide, please. Now, this is sort of in the background of Hofmeier's argument here. But she's trying to identify the ways in which the Indian Ocean has a different cultural and historical logic. Once mastered by mariners, she writes, the monsoon enabled deep-sea travel and trade in the Indian Ocean. These trade networks were further consolidated and promoted by the spread of Islam in the Indian Ocean from the 8th century onward, which helped to weave together a series of cosmopolitan port cities: Kilwa, Mombasa, Malindi, Mogadishu, Jeddah, Aden, Muscat, Cambay, Calicut, and so on. This is beginning to be familiar terrain. I touched upon it yesterday when talking about Abdul Razak Gurna. And I think the enduring point here really is that the Indian Ocean has a much older cultural history, really, than the Atlantic Ocean, and that this is very much because of its sort of meteorological features. The monsoon winds that at one point sort of blow towards the northeast, then change direction and blow to the southwest instead, making it possible to travel by sail across this vast ocean. Next slide, please. And here is then a very central point made by Hofmeier, that these intellectual circuits produced a world of cross-cutting and contesting universalisms, producing a view of colonialism less as an encounter of the local and the global than as a contestation of different universalisms. And this then becomes an interesting contrast to the Black Atlantic, which is so much more a history of exclusively a history of domination and exploitation, conditions under which slave descendants nonetheless have been able to assert themselves and prevail in different ways. But the cultural logic of the Indian Ocean and historical logic is then different. Next slide, please. So this is what brings us to Gandhi's printing press. And I don't know, some of you may have read Hofmeier's work, and this particular notion, Gandhi's printing press, is actually the title then of one of her books. And what needs to be recognized here is that there is a significant Indian presence in South Africa. So beginning around 1860, increasing numbers of Indian laborers, and to some extent merchants, but mainly indentured laborers, arrived in South Africa. And by 1910, there were more than 150,000. And this presence has remained. If you were to visit Durban, especially the neighborhood of Chatsworth, I believe that you would feel pretty much at home. it has a strong sort of Indian character. And then, as you know, Mohandas Gandhi was active in South Africa for, well, more than 2 decades. And these were formative years in his life. It's when where he developed his satyagraha philosophy and pioneered forms of resistance that would then be pivotal in the Indian struggle against the British. So that's the historical sort of backdrop to Hofmeier's book. Next slide. So she's emphasizing here the cosmopolitan dimension of the Indian Ocean trade and cultural network. The epic mobility of 19th century imperialism, she writes, engendered a rich array of transnational imaginings as displaced and dispersed communities had to envisage their position in a new order. In these port cities, Arya Samajists, Theosophists, Sufis, Pan-Buddhists, Sikh transnationalists, African nationalists, white laborists, and those espousing imperial citizenship established transoceanic organizations speaking in global idioms. So in much of what she's done, Hofmeyr can be described as an historian of the empire, the British Empire, but it's obviously a revisionist understanding of empire. It's sort of tries to identify all the different communities that shaped and connected within the empire in ways that far sort of exceeded the British imagination of the empire. Yes. So next slide, please. So much of the book is focused then on this publication, Indian Opinion, which started publishing in 1903, and the image here is actually from an edition from 1916, which is after Gandhi had left South Africa. But I mean, Indian Opinion would continue to publish long after he left the country. But the book is focused on those early years. And one of the things that interests Isabel Hofmeyr is well the specifics of printing and how they actually managed to pull this off. So this was a very small operation, really, in Durban, and the journal as such would never. I mean, it only reached the elite, you could say, among the diasporic Indians in South Africa. I don't think circulation really, at least under Gandhi's years, went beyond 2000 or so. So it was a small endeavor, and it was printed at the International Printing Press. which boasted of being able to print in 10 languages and 7 scripts. And this, I think Hoffman is entirely right in emphasizing that this is something quite remarkable. And speaks volumes of precisely that diasporic cosmopolitanism of which he speaks, the diasporic cosmopolitanism along the coasts of the Indian Ocean. Next slide, please. So it was called a newspaper, Indian opinion, but Hoffmeyer's argument is that it actually functioned as a gathering space for a variety of texts circulating around the Indian Ocean. So it would sort of reprint material, and it hardly respected what we today would think of as copyright, but nor would Gandhi insist on copyright for original material published in the Indian Opinion. So she's, in other words, looking at this object, the Indian Opinion, and trying to understand what was actually going on there. I mean, the fact that, as you can see here in this image, it was published in English and Gujarati, and I think in the beginning there were 2 or 3 more languages in Indian languages in Indian Opinion. Demonstrates precisely how it becomes this gathering space, but it only becomes legible to certain readers, and those readers essentially belong to the diasporic Indian elite. Now, one of Hoffmeyer's ideas in this book, the subtitle is "Experiment in Slow Reading," is that Gandhi, who was very sort of anti-commercial in his thinking, and in many ways anti-modern, he wanted the journal to be to sort of train the reader to read slowly and reflectively. This is a slightly speculative aspect of Hoffmeyer's argument, but it's very interesting to sort of follow her as she develops that idea. I think I'll read 2 paragraphs from the book that sort of add to the motivation for this study and for its approach to these issues. She begins by saying that there are currently rich legacies of scholarship on transnational histories of print. Yet these studies tend to operate in circumscribed areas: the transatlantic book trade, print and printers in the White Dominions, and media in British India. Studies of transnational religious publishing are likewise balkanized and tend to follow the watersheds of particular faiths. Accounts of Christian mission publishing in sub-Saharan Africa, for example, pay little attention to Indian diasporic print ventures or African commercial concerns, creating the impression that all printing in this region is of European Christian evangelical provenance. To complicate such views, one need only consider the printing sector in any of the major cities in southern or East Africa, in which several diasporic groups intersected. In these settings, Muslim printers from Bombay, Africans tutored in Protestant evangelical presses, Indians and Britons trained in mission, state-run, or commercial printing concerns in the subcontinent, and British printers, as well as print workers from diasporic locales like Mauritius, converged. These journeymen shaped multilingual, multiracial, and multi-religious printing ventures, working with and against each other. So this is really the world that Hofmeyr has sort of caught sight of, and Indian opinion then becomes a focal point through which that excitingly heterogeneous world becomes visible. Next slide, please. Now, within the space of the periodical, Hofmeyr continues, Gandhi wished to create a notion of India as existing both territorially and deterritorially, meaning, among other things, that the detail, a particular text, could stand in for the whole. And I really think this makes a lot of sense. What she's trying to get at here is how Gandhi tried to sort of square the circle. He was positioned in South Africa. He struggled on behalf of the Indian population's rights. He was at this time very skeptical and even hostile towards the claims made by African groups. So he was working sort of in the name of something that was some community that converged sort of around the name India. But at the same time, it was physically very distant from India. So I think this is what Hofmeyr wants to get at here, that India is both territory, land, but it's also something more, and that something more becomes sort of visible on the pages of Indian opinion. Next slide. So I won't be spending a lot of time now exploring these literary examples. I'm just returning, first of all, to Still Life by Zoe Wickham, because now that you know more about the notion of the Black Atlantic, I think that novel and the ways in which Wickham sort of includes Mary Prince, the emancipated West Indian slave, as a character, can make more sense. You can see how this is, by one description, a Black Atlantic novel. And then we have, again, Abdul Gurna. I've already mentioned how he, in his novels, invokes this Indian Ocean Muslim cosmopolis. And if there's any single of his novel, any single one of the novels I would sort of point to, if you want to explore this, would be By the Sea, which is the story of a refugee, a migrant in India, in Britain, sorry, and how this past then comes to have an impact on his life, and he recalls a completely different world in Zanzibar. And then I'm also including Amitav Ghosh here as one of these Indian Ocean writers who's been extremely significant, I would say, even in making this making the importance of the Indian Ocean, the historical importance, evident. This was something he first did in that early novel, In an Antique Land, where there's one sort of historical narrative thread about a Jewish Tunisian merchant and his travels. Sea of Poppies, of course. This is the first book in his Ibis trilogy, and that novel and that trilogy is so much about the Indian Ocean and the cultures and lives of people on the ocean. Ghosh is very fond of the Lascars, for instance, the sailors who had really their own culture and their own idiom, and these could be people brought together on ship from all different parts of the Indian Ocean, and were the ones who really kept this this traffic going. So those are examples that I just invite you to explore more if you are interested in this angle. But let's next slide, please. Let's just reflect now a bit on the theoretical implications of what I've been saying, because in my previous lectures, and especially the first more theoretical lecture, I heavily emphasized how temporality can be narrated, and how that model of the space of experience and horizon of expectation provides a key whereby the specific quality of temporality can be described. Now, this is a slightly different, shall we say, literary take on the matter, and I'm sure you're familiar with Mikhail Bakhtin, the Russian philosopher and literary critic, who, with almost a 50-year delay, became known in the West through translation. But one of his key terms is the chronotope, and it's one of these terms that are very sort of suggestive and enticing, but also elusive. But nonetheless, this is what he says about the chronotope. In the literary artistic chronotope, spatial and temporal indicators are fused into one carefully thought out concrete whole. Time, as it were, thickens, takes on flesh, becomes artistically visible. Likewise, space becomes charged and responsive to the movements of time, plot, and history. The intersection of axes and fusion of indicators characterizes the artistic chronotope. So he's insisting on seeing this as really an aesthetic category, and that when we read literature, see plays, this becomes sort of an analytical term that makes it possible for us to see what's going on. I think one of these examples of a chronotope in popular culture has been the saloon in the American Western film. That's where so much comes together and drives the plot of those stories. But I would, since we in our first lecture agreed that there isn't an absolute line separating sort of factual history from fictional narrative. These two categories depend very much on one another. And so it is also with our a theoretical concept. So if we adopt concepts like the Black Atlantic and the Indian Ocean as shall we say frameworks for further investigation, I think it's fair to also call them chronotopes. So the Indian Ocean provides us with a very particular chronotope on a macro scale that makes certain histories visible and certainly makes histories that previously were invisible more visible. Next slide, please. So some of the implications of focusing on oceans is that this resists a nation-based history, and nation-based histories are almost by definition land-based histories. They also privilege connection and mobility rather than territorial belonging. So again, by adopting this chronotope, other things become visible, other things come into view and become important. And last but not least, the oceans as a theory chronotope makes visible the watered nature of the southern hemisphere. So in India, you live sort of in the southern part of a massive landmass, the Eurasian landmass. And then we have North America, which is also huge. And the distribution between land and sea is entirely different between the two hemispheres. So 80% of the southern hemisphere consists of ocean. And this is becoming significant in contemporary literary and cultural studies especially in South Africa and Australia, I would say. But it also leads towards the huge field of environmental humanities and how the focus on the oceans also provides another angle on the Anthropocene, which is so much discussed in environmental humanities. Next slide, please. So here are just a few reading suggestions if you want to look more closely into sort of oceanic studies, there's a book by Sharon Lavery, Writing Ocean Worlds, Indian Ocean Fiction in English. And then there's a chapter by Meg Samuelson in this handbook that I've edited, The Ocean, which is very informative. And I think it can be inspiring if you want to sort of develop this mode of analysis. Right, I think that's the last slide. Let's see, is there another slide? No. So that's the last one. That's what I had for today. But I have for the tutorial session, I've suggested to Viva that we see 15 minutes of a lecture by Isabel Hofmeyr that will repeat some of the points I've made, but also gives you a sense of how she works. And question is if we should have a 5-minute break the way we did yesterday and then resume. What do you say, Viva?
Uh, yes, I think while we are watching the video, you can take a break
Okay.
and the students can continue watching. But they have
Okay.
left. I think some of them have left. All right, so we break for 5 minutes. So we break for 5 minutes.
Okay. And then just to clarify, in that video, I suggest that we watch from 6 minutes to 21 minutes,
Okay.
because that's the beginning of her lecture. All right, but
Yes.
we'll resume in 5 minutes, quite simply. Thank you.
Okay. So you have noted, whoever is presenting the video, please make sure that you
Y-
start it from the 6 minutes timestamp
Yes,
and it will
ma'am.
go until okay.
Okay.
So when
Thank you.
we come back, then you start this.
Yes, ma'am. Sure. Thank you.
Shall we restart?
Yes, this is a good moment.
Yes.
Thank you, Alison, for that wonderful introduction. It is really such a great pleasure and an honor to be here to deliver this lecture, but more importantly, to be associated with this exquisite and extraordinary exhibition, World on the Horizon. And if you haven't seen it, it really is a quite remarkable, as you'll see, a remarkable kind of collection of objects from all over the world. My thanks also to Antoinette Burton, to Alison and to Prita Meyer for this invitation, and it's a really great pleasure to be here. Okay, so let's get going, and let's begin with I think one of the great books of the Indian Ocean, Abdul Razak Gurna's novel By the Sea. Okay. The narrative opens in Zanzibar and traces the story of two families feuding over property. The feud is set in motion when a dashing Persian merchant from Bahrain arrives in the monsoon season and seduces the young son of one of the families, while ensnaring the other in a complicated loan using the house of the first family as collateral. So a complicated plot. Also important is a beautiful ebony table which the Persian trader buys as a gift for the young boy he is seducing, and which he purchases with cash and a £20 packet of rare incense from Bangkok. There is, of course, much more in the novel, but I think for our purposes this evening, what is important is that the plot is set in motion from the ocean. The arrival of the Persian trader by sea precipitates the storyline. It is hence a story that comes from the sea. Also important are the objects that arrive from across the ocean, the ebony table, possibly from Ceylon or Makassar, and the incense from Bangkok. The novel is a tale of the seductive and at times destructive power of the stories and objects that come from far away, from across the ocean, or as the title suggests, by the sea, i.e. by means of the sea. Now I start with these themes since they resonate with this exhibition World on the Horizon, which is concerned with objects in the sea, or as the advertising material indicates, the affective power of objects to create networks of affinity across different cultures. As Prita Meyer says in her book, Swahili Port Cities, The Architecture of Elsewhere, and I quote, exotic objects fulfilled a desire to possess and amass the materiality of far away. These objects paid tribute to mobility and the ability to make the exotic one's own. She calls these objects relational loci. So objects, they configured different cultural traditions, and such objects could, as she said, they could not be traced back to one place or one society. The Swahili coast asks us to reconsider where Africa, Asia, and Europe begin and end. Now, my talk this evening is intended as a very broad orientation for this remarkable and exquisite exhibition. And I'll attempt to take some of its concerns and explore these in order to give you some sense of the big themes of Indian Ocean history. So what I'm going to do is begin with a shortish section really of Indian Ocean 101 to give you some very basic background, and I hope it's not too basic. And then I'll explore these themes through our 5 objects for this evening: a style of cloth, a shrine, a ship, a book, and a jellyfish. Okay, so let's begin then with our 101 section, and we begin with a figure who will be familiar to all of you, Mark Twain, who in 1896 undertook a world trip. In April of that year, he traveled by steamship, or ocean greyhound as he called them, from Calcutta to Mauritius, which is Mauritius just being to the right of Madagascar. And in his diary, he noted, "We are upon the smooth waters of the Indian Ocean, nothing in sight from horizon to horizon, a cooling breeze. There is no mail to read and answer, no newspapers, no telegrams. If I had my way, I would sail on forever and never go to live on the solid ground again." Now, there is much that one could say about Twain's Indian Ocean travels, but what concerns us this evening is one rather circumstantial detail, namely the cooling breeze that he mentions. Now, while the movement of the steamer would have generated something of a breeze, a vessel traveling southeast at that time of year, April, would have been heading into the monsoon winds, just beginning to blow quietly from the southwest before picking up in intensity a few weeks later. Then 6 to 8 months later, the winds would reverse direction and blow the other way around. Now, the seasonal regime of winds is one of the paramount environmental factors of the Indian Ocean world. The word itself comes from the Arabic, mawsim meaning season, and the system arises from the fact that the Indian Ocean has a kind of ceiling, i.e. its northern edge is blocked by a massive continental landmass. Land and water deal with heat in different ways, producing patterns of high and low pressure and consequently of wind as well as of rain. So as Edward Elpers indicates in his book, and I quote, "From November through January, pressure builds up over continental Asia and blows dry winds from Arabia and Western India towards Eastern Africa and from China towards Southeast Asia. From April to August, this process is reversed as high pressure zones in the southern hemisphere push strong winds towards the north." Now, the seasonal regime has shaped the rhythm of life around the ocean for millennia, bringing rain to farmers, blowing dhows across the ocean, and enabling trade between the different ecological zones of the Indian Ocean arena. Now, so this monsoon makes the Indian Ocean basin a benign environment for long-distance voyaging, unlike the Atlantic, which is difficult to cross both ways by sail, given that the prevailing winds blow in one direction throughout the year. The Indian Ocean is hence the world's oldest long-distance transoceanic trading arena, which has been crossed for millennia, and it's sometimes known as the cradle of globalization. There is, of course, much of the Indian Ocean that falls outside the monsoon-created world, the monsoon-created region, which you see there as more, as the pink bit. But as we'll see later, the influence of this monsoon-created world reaches well beyond its borders. Now, given that these long millennia of trade and exchange, one key concern of Indian Ocean studies has been a focus on cultural interaction and cosmopolitanism. Port cities around the littoral of the ocean have sustained deep forms of material, intellectual, and cultural exchange, so that denizens of these ports often had more in common with each other than with their fellows inland. This early cosmopolitan world has famously been explored in Amitav Ghosh's In an Antique Land, which contrasts the rigidity of borders in the 1980s when the book was written with the relative ease of movement in the late medieval Indian Ocean world, a theme explored through the travels of Abram bin Yiju, a 12th century Jewish Tunisian merchant, also a calligrapher and a poet, based in Cairo and then in India. Now, central to these histories of mobility and exchange in the Indian Ocean has been the spread of Islam across land and sea from the 7th century of the Common Era. These religious networks extended and energized the already existing long-distance trading interactions, providing an enabling framework in terms of commerce, shared legal, educational, and spiritual structures, as well as the centrifugal power of the Hajj. By the 14th century, mercantile networks were almost entirely in the hands of Muslim traders. In their wake came scholars, theologians, Sufi divine, Sufism, the mystical version of Islam, being an extremely important strand in Indian Ocean history, and there are traces of Sufism in the exhibition, as you'll see. So Islam in the Indian Ocean arena came to constitute, quote, the largest cultural continuum in the world, as Abdul Sharif has argued in his book on the Indian Ocean. When the Portuguese rounded the Cape in the 15th century, they entered what many have termed a Muslim lake, dominated in the north by the Turkish Ottoman, the Persian Safavid, and the Indian Mughal empires. When the Dutch arrived in the Indian Ocean a bit later, they were able to go from one end of it to another by carrying letters of introduction from Muslim sultans on various shores. Now, as the scholar Eng Seng Ho has indicated, these sprawling networks of Muslim commerce were transacted without the backing of an army or a state. And I quote from him. He says, the Portuguese, the Dutch, and the English in the Indian Ocean were strange new traders who brought their states with them. They created militarized trading post empires in the Indian Ocean, following Venetian and Genoese precedents in the Mediterranean, and were wont to do business at the point of a gun. While early European entrants to the Indian Ocean world had initially to accommodate themselves to the trading orders that they encountered, by the 19th century, European empires dominated the Indian Ocean arena. With their military, transport, and communication infrastructure, these empires intensified the movement of people across the Indian Ocean world. Much of this mobility was forced and conscripted and involved slaves, indentured laborers, political exiles, and prisoners who were transported between different regions of the Indian Ocean world. At times, these systems built on existing foundations of labor exploitation. So, as some recent research indicates, South Asian indentured laborers, of whom we'll hear a bit more later, were often taken from regions in India where slavery had long existed. So then old and new systems of unfree labor articulated to produce what some have called a carceral archipelago of prisons, plantations, and penal colonies. Now, an archive of such depth and density going back millennia, the Indian Ocean has become an important site for relativizing European-dominated accounts of world history. In such a schema, the age of European empires is but one tiny little sliver in a much bigger arc of history. A view from the Indian Ocean also unsettles notions of European colonizers as purveyors of global grand schemes, as opposed to colonized groups who are often seen as local or parochial. The encounters between Indian Ocean societies and European imperialisms were not simply a case of a globalizing colonizer versus a provincial colonized. Instead, as historians like Eng Seng Ho and Shugata Bose have indicated, the Indian Ocean became an arena of competing universalistic claims. The ambition of British imperialism, for example, were countered by the equally grand visions of Islam. The ancient diffusionism of Hinduism and Buddhism from India into East and Southeast Asia was held up as a benign mode of imperialism that showed up the shortcomings of European colonialism. Indeed, the Indian Ocean arena has produced a very rich repertoire of transoceanic ideologies, be it pan-Islam, Hindu reformism, or pan-Buddhism. Such ideologies inevitably came to carry an anti-imperial inflection, which subsequently fed into ideas of Afro-Asian solidarity and non-alignment arising out of the Bandung Conference in 1955, at which 29 newly independent nations gathered to forge a new path rather than falling in line with either of the rival camps in the emerging Cold War.
Actually, we can stop there. That's
So
where
as
I
long as-
thought we were going to. Right. Excellent.
Thank, thank you for playing the video on the history of the Indian Ocean world in 5 objects. This video provided us with a fascinating look at how material culture helps us understand the historical connections, trade networks, and cultural exchanges that shape the Indian Ocean world. It offered valuable insights into the broader context of our discussion today. We appreciate your help in sharing this resource. Thank you, Professor Heliason, for your insightful session. We now move on to the tutorial segment where participants can raise their questions and engage in discussions based on the lecture.
Precisely.
Or maybe
Thank
some
you so
insights
much.
on the YouTube video that was played. For those who have questions, please drop them in the chat box. We will address as many as possible.
Exactly. So we can do this very informally and also wrap up earlier if you wish. But I can just comment on this lecture. I mean, it's always wonderful to listen to Isabel, and as you noticed, this lecture repeats several of the points I've been making, and I think I can make two interesting observations. One is precisely the importance of literary writing, of fiction, in making these connections visible to us today. So she brings up there both Gurna and Amitav Ghosh. And the other really important point, and I drew your attention to it in my own lecture as well, is how the Indian Ocean becomes this arena of competing universalistic claims. And I would need to be more of an historian to really be able to judge whether that benign image of the earlier sort of trading network is entirely correct. I couldn't say, but there seems to be much that speaks in its favor. What we do know is that the European colonizers introduced a very violent way of pursuing their aims. Yeah. I suppose a question I would have for you, there's a question coming. I'll address that shortly. The question I would have for you is if there's anyone among you who are working sort of with the Indian Ocean paradigm in your own studies or your own research. So here is, yes, considering the role of the Indian Ocean as a space of cultural and political exchange, how did interactions between Indian and African communities influence early anti-colonial movements in South Africa? Good question. And it's not entirely easy to answer because at the beginning, as I implied, Gandhi's activism in South Africa was directed very much at sort of at the white government, demanding that Indians be granted the same rights as other whites. But Gandhi was not struggling in solidarity with Africans who were making the same demands, basically. So there was no real sense of there being a common cause between those groups. And a detail that Hofmeyr mentions, a very interesting one, is that Gandhi lived sort of in a rural area not far from Durban, and just a short stretch from there, a very famous African nationalist, John Dewey, had sort of set up his school and worked towards sort of mobilizing Africans in the anti-colonial cause. So the first answer to that question is that there were actually few interactions, and some of those interactions were in fact conflictual. The second answer to that question is that this would change over time. And most significant, and I'll probably be talking about this a bit in my second lecture today, was the rise of Black consciousness in the 1970s in South Africa. And this became a major challenge for the white apartheid government at the time, and represented something new. So the ANC in the 1950s had cultivated a very what they called a multiracial approach, and you had Indians who became prominent and important in the ANC, South African Indians at the time. Interestingly, what happened with Black consciousness was that, and the key figure here is Steve Biko, was that the struggle became defined very much in racial terms, but race became defined as a political construct. So what Black consciousness did was that it provided an inclusive understanding of the term Black, meaning everyone in South Africa that was oppressed by the apartheid laws. In other words, those population groups I mentioned yesterday, coloreds, Asians, Africans. And that really, even more than the ANC's politics in the 1950s, cultivated a strong ties of solidarity between groups in South Africa, and would in turn influence the ANC, and several of the key figures in the early ANC governments from the 1990s and onwards had a South African Indian background. So that would be the longer answer. Okay. Weber has posted a question here. Ocean memories are an essential part of the entire discourse on the environmental humanities. Indian Ocean has been connected to slave trade of its own, similar to the Atlantic slave trade route. Yes, and this is clearly the case. And at the same time, I think one also needs to recognize differences between Indian Ocean slavery and transatlantic slavery. there's overlap, but there are also differences. And I suppose one of the differences is that the definition of slavery in the Indian Ocean context was much broader. So I spoke yesterday about Goenau's novel Paradise and the ways in which he depicts the fate of Yusuf, who becomes a Rahani. So that was one form of slavery, domestic slavery. And I don't know, Viva, if you would like to say anything more about this topic, Indian Ocean slavery. Perhaps not. Okay.
Thank you for that detailed explanation, Professor. We encourage everyone to keep their questions coming.
Yes, precisely. There's one. You discussed the significance of Kilwa potsherds in understanding trade networks. What insights do these artifacts give us about the everyday lives of traders and local populations in places like Kilwa, Mombasa, or Calicut? Yes. Well, this is Hofmeyr discussing them. I don't have any privileged insight into this, I must say. I think the point I wanted to make when I introduced Isabel's work is precisely that she tends to follow the object, and the main object in her case is the book, really, the printed book and the line or periodical, and the ways in which these objects sort of move both in time and space. So that's the very general answer I can give. A more specific answer has to do with well, archaeological findings in Mozambique and I think even Zimbabwe, where one has found fragments of porcelain of China that clearly had arrived on those shores long before the European colonizers. So to actually think, I mean, if I were to retrain as an archaeologist, which I I won't be doing, but if I were to do that, I think there's a lot of work that still can be done on sort of uncovering those early histories of the trade networks. So keep thinking about that. I mean, that's something that could really be explored in greater depth. Question from Adil. Can you elaborate on how oceanic approaches provide a different perspective on African history compared to traditional land-based narratives? Yes, certainly. I think it's first of all important to recognize how in the setup of modernity, the territorial nation state has been seen as completely inescapable, as as an essential requirement for being and belonging in the world. And as we see from current horrifying conflicts, the Ukraine and Gaza, Palestine, this territorial paradigm has been and remains terribly destructive. While at the same time, there's no one who really is able to see any way out of it. Now, in Africa, in African history, and I can speak mainly about African literary history, and that's my sort of approach to history. It's worth noting differences. So there's certainly much African literature that is not very concerned with the nation state as such, but provides us with accounts of African life. So Things Fall Apart is really one example. It is not a nationalist Nigerian story, but it is African, and African literature has often been understood as this sort of transnational space. But there are other literatures in Africa that have been very national and land-based, such as Angolan and Mozambican literature, especially Angola, where literature has been essential in constructing an imaginary of the territorial nation. Okay, so that's one side of it. What the oceanic approach does is to make visible the connectedness of Africa, and I would say that this is perhaps the main difference. Part of the destructive legacy of colonialism has been to think of Africa as something set apart. It's outside of history. It's outside of modernity. Oceanic approaches show us that no, on the contrary, it's always been a part of the world, and I think that's what Gerna's, Miyakoto's work contributes to. A novel such as Still Life by Wickham also places in this case the Cape in this transoceanic context. So that's what I think we can see is the important point with the oceanic approach. And then there's the whole environmental dimension as well. Yeah, we have more questions here. So could you elaborate on the connection between Gandhi's early activism and broader decolonial movements in Africa? I'm not really the right person to answer that question. What I can say is that there emerged in the 1960s, perhaps it began in the 50s, but especially in the 1960s, a form of what Robert Young has called a tricontinental consciousness, which sort of brought together Africa, Asia, and Latin America into one sort of very, very capacious sort of anti-colonial community. And one writer which has really valued the Afro-Asian connection is the Kenyan writer Ngugi wa Thiong'o. So it's something that turns up every now and then in his essays and novels. If you read his novel Wizard of the Crow, you will see that India figures there as well. So if you want to explore this more specifically, there's for instance a journal that was published in the 60s called Lotus, and there is quite a lot of work being done on these African Asian connections. Right. And then there's a question here: how did Gandhi's printing press endowment shape public discourse and mobilization among Indian immigrants in South Africa? Well, apparently it did have an impact, and I mean, I would suggest that you read Hoffman's book. There are also other histories of the early sort of anti-colonial movements in South Africa, and Gandhi managed to construct a very sort of high profile, and he was in touch very much with the Prime Minister of South Africa at the time, Jan Smuts, and there were important sort of activist manifestations, not least in Johannesburg, that where sort of Gandhi's importance must not be underestimated. So I'm afraid, since Gandhi really isn't I haven't specialized on Gandhi. That's a very general response, but I think that gives you some idea. He was significant, and I think Indian opinion reached influential people within the diasporic community at the time. Right. I think this has been a long and rich session, and it's probably a good moment to end there. And I'll be seeing you later.
Shall we conclude the session now? If there are more questions.
I think this is a good moment to
Okay, sir.
wrap
Sure.
up.
So with this, we conclude the first session and tutorial of day 4 of our GIAN course. A big thank you to Professor Stefan Helgason for his insightful lecture and engaging discussion during the tutorial. We will reconvene in the evening at 8:30 p.m. IST for our next session, titled Looking Back at Apartheid in South Africa. We look forward to seeing you all then. Until then, thank you for your participation and have a great afternoon.
Thank you.